Parachutists are fighting today from Port Moresby to North Africa. They're trained to battle in any part of the world, in any climate, on any terrain, desert or snow. The training is tough. So is the job.
I find Americans to be almost illiterate about their own history. A question which I sometimes ask my students is, what do you think the War of 1812 signified? Almost no student can answer that question. What's important about the War of 1812? Well, of course, what's important about it is that it's the last war in which Europeans tried to capture a part of the North American continent. The English tried, after they were defeated, they realized that America was going to penetrate the world of trade of Western Europe, and they felt that they could recover a part of North America if they could seize a portion of the South. They were defeated in this, but they had a kind of wild conspiracy, you know. They actually arranged a kind of contract with American Indian tribes. They were going to use American Indians to fight the war, and the Indians didn't understand the Western notions of warfare. So they were interested in, let us say, one engagement, which went badly, and then they lost interest in it. They couldn't be counted on anymore. They also were going to use Canada to offset American forces. They had a grand conspiracy to penetrate North America again, and they failed. And then also the French began to board American vessels for the same reasons. Even though France had been an ally of America in the American Revolutionary War, for the same trading reasons, they tried to frighten the Americans out of a certain sphere of activity. This is an amateur account of the early history of America that I'm giving, but I think it must be fairly close to the truth. Now, I don't know the full answer to this. I think it has to do with the peculiar sense in which Americans live in the here and now. They don't have even a clear sense of history, let alone historicity. They live in the moment. And I think that what the pragmatists meant about explaining meaning in the here and now is a cut above what ordinary Americans think of as the context of life. So, for example, when Bush talks about, the first George Bush talks about the end of the first Iraq War, the Iraqi War, he is saying that, you know, our side has won. Capitalism, liberalism, in the sense in which we talk about it, is obviously the victor. But he doesn't see it in historical terms. And Americans don't seem to. I mean, if you ask an American about the sort of line of history, for example, a favorite question of mine is, what's the relationship between Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush, historically? Well, I think the answer is, to some extent, they hold exactly the same point of view, okay? That can't be said except in terms of some reading of the span of history, in terms of a sort of interpretive unity that ordinary Americans just don't ever play with. I don't mean that I'm exceptional to make this point. I only mean that my training has sensitized me to thinking about historical connection in that way. And I joke about it by claiming that I'm not an Earthling. I'm really a visitor from Mars. I mean, up on the planet Mars, we do honor history and historicity. And I come down to Earth and I see that the Earthlings don't really pay, at least American Earthlings, don't pay attention to this idea. But I think has something to do with the preoccupation of Americans with their niche, the immediate circumstances in which they satisfy their needs and desires, and they have to be sort of dragged kicking to pay attention to a sort of articulated history of the conditions under which their own life is lived. The point I'm making is that Americans don't know even the high points of their own history. And they have, first of all, an impoverished sense. They've always had an impoverished sense of history. And they have had no idea of historicity, seems to me. And now it seems to me that along the lines I've been suggesting, there's no real difference between philosophy and politics. So that it's not unreasonable that if we don't know our political history, we don't know our philosophical history either. We don't see that pragmatism is an offshoot of Hegelian thinking. I think this is absolutely true. Peirce was a reader of both Kant and Hegel, and even though he indicates his admiration for Kant, and he says relatively little about Hegel, I think he's a kind of Hegelianized Kant.